Imagine standing before the most fortified city in the ancient world. Walls so thick that families built their homes inside them. Walls so tall that soldiers on top looked like insects from the ground below. Walls that had never been broken, never been breached, never been conquered. And now, a barefoot people who had spent 40 years wandering a desert were being told by their God to simply walk around it. This is not just a story about crumbling stone. This is a story about the moment a nation chose to believe the impossible and watched the impossible happen. This is the Fall of Jericho. To understand what happened at Jericho, you have to understand what Jericho was. It was not simply a city, it was a statement. Positioned at the very entrance to the land of Canaan, sitting at approximately 846 feet below sea level, Jericho holds the distinction of being one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in human history. Archaeologists have found evidence of settlement there reaching back over 10,000 years. 10,000 years. When Joshua and the Israelites arrived at its gates, Jericho had already seen empires rise and fall, had already watched generations of conquerors pass through the Jordan Valley. The city sat like a locked door between the desert and the promised land. A door that said, "You shall not pass." The walls of ancient Jericho were extraordinary by any measure of their time. Excavations have revealed a stone retaining wall nearly 15 feet high, topped by a mud brick parapet that rose even higher. Beyond that, there was an outer wall and an inner wall, creating a corridor of death for any army foolish enough to attack. The total defensive structure was estimated to be over 40 feet in height. In the ancient world, that was essentially impenetrable without siege equipment, without months of sustained assault, without battering rams and catapults, and the full machinery of a modern ancient military force. Joshua's army had none of that. What they had was something far more unusual. But before we reach the walls, we have to go back. Back to the river, back to the moment everything shifted. Because the Fall of Jericho does not begin with a trumpet blast. It begins with wet sandals and a dry path through the water. The Israelites had been in the wilderness for 40 years. An entire generation had been born, lived, and died without ever setting foot on the other side of the Jordan River. The generation that had fled Egypt, that had seen the parting of the Red Sea with their own eyes, that had watched Moses descend from Sinai with stone tablets glowing. Most of them were gone. The people now gathered on the eastern bank of the Jordan were younger, hungrier, and in many ways less certain. They had heard the stories, but hearing is different from seeing. Moses himself was dead. He had led his people to the threshold of the promised land, and then, in a moment that still carries tremendous weight, he was allowed to see it from a mountaintop, but never to enter it. The leadership had passed to Joshua, the son of Nun, a military man, a man of action, one of only 2 of the original scouts sent into Canaan 40 years earlier, who had come back with a report of faith rather than fear. And now it was his moment. God spoke to Joshua with words that have echoed across millennia. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. These were not empty comfort words. They were a commission, a mandate, a declaration that what was about to happen would not be accomplished by human strategy alone. The Jordan River at flood season, which is exactly when this crossing took place, was not a gentle stream. It was a swollen, churning, dangerous body of water that had overflowed its banks. There was no ford, no shallow place to wade through. Crossing it with an entire nation, men, women, children, livestock, the elderly, was, by any rational assessment, impossible. And yet the priests lifted the Ark of the Covenant onto their shoulders, stepped into the water, and the river stopped. Not gradually, not as a slow ebb. The waters piled up in a great heap upstream, described in the text as far away as a city called Adam, and the people crossed on dry ground. The same miracle that had opened the Red Sea for their grandparents now opened the Jordan for them. 12 stones were taken from the middle of the riverbed and set up as a monument, a memorial so that future generations, when they asked what those stones meant, could be told, "This is where God held back the waters." Word spread immediately. It always does. The kings of the Amorites west of the Jordan and the kings of the Canaanites near the sea heard what had happened, and the text records something remarkable. Their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them. Fear moved through Canaan like a wave. The Jordan crossing was not just a miracle, it was a psychological earthquake. But the people of Jericho did not flee. They could not. They retreated behind their walls, and they bolted their gates, and they waited. Jericho was shut up tight, as the ancient text puts it. No one went out, and no one came in. And it was in this tense silence, this locked standoff between a city of stone and a people of promise, that God gave Joshua the strangest military orders in the history of warfare. March around the city once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, march around it 7 times. Have the priests blow their trumpets. And then, when you hear the long blast of the ram's horn, have all the people shout, and the walls will fall. There is a moment in every great story where the reader or the listener has to make a choice. Either they lean in or they step back. Either the strangeness of what they are hearing pulls them forward with wonder, or it pushes them away with skepticism, because what God described to Joshua was not a military strategy. There was no flanking maneuver, no catapult placement, no calculated weak point in the defensive structure. There was no strategy at all, not in any human sense. There was just walking, and silence, and then, eventually, sound. Think about what that must have felt like for the soldiers in Joshua's army. These were warriors. These were men who had trained, who understood the mechanics of combat, who knew what it meant to take a fortified city. And now they were being told to walk quietly around the walls once a day and go back to camp. And think about what it must have felt like for the people of Jericho watching from the walls. Who were these people? What were they doing? Why weren't they attacking? The psychological weight of that silence, of an army that did not behave like an army, of a threat that refused to announce itself in any familiar way, must have been deeply unsettling. There is one character in this story who stands apart from the others, and her name is Rahab. Before the march began, before the crossing of the Jordan, Joshua had sent 2 spies into Jericho. Not an army, not a scout team. 2 men. Their mission: observe the land. Their unexpected refuge: the house of a woman named Rahab, a prostitute who lived in a home built into the city wall itself. The king of Jericho heard about the spies and sent men to arrest them. And Rahab made a decision that changed everything for her. She hid the spies under bundles of flax on her roof and told the king's messengers that the men had already left. She protected strangers at great personal risk, and then she told those strangers exactly why she did it. She had heard. She had heard about what God had done at the Red Sea. She had heard what had happened to the Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan. She knew, and she believed. This woman, not a member of the Israelite nation, not someone raised in the tradition of the covenant, not a priest or a prophet, or a person of visible status. She was the one inside Jericho who had eyes to see what was actually happening. She struck a deal with the spies, a scarlet cord. When the city falls, tie this red thread in your window and keep your family inside, and they will be spared. The 2 men swore an oath to her, and when they left, they descended by that same scarlet cord through the window of her wall-side home and disappeared into the night. The scarlet cord in the window, a crimson thread against the stone, a signal of faith made visible. It would hang there through 6 days of silent marching, through the growing tension, through the moment everything changed. Now the march began. Day 1. The armed soldiers went first. then the 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horn trumpets, then the Ark of the Covenant carried on the shoulders of the Levites, shrouded in its coverings, then the rear guard, and the people, thousands of people circling in silence, no war cries, no taunts to the soldiers watching from the walls, no shouted challenges or declarations of conquest. Joshua had given specific instructions. Do not shout. Do not let your voice be heard. Do not let a word come out of your mouth until I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. The silence must have been eerie. The only sound was the low, mournful blowing of the trumpets, the steady sound of feet on the earth, the creak of sandals, the rustle of clothing, the breathing of a multitude moving in deliberate, purposeful quiet. And then it was over. They had completed 1 circuit of the city, and they walked back to their camp. Day 2, the same. Day 3, the same. Day 4. Day 5. Day 6. Every single day, this silent procession wound its way around Jericho, the trumpets blowing, the people saying nothing, and then the army returning to camp as the sun went down. Can you imagine what the defenders of Jericho felt during those 6 days? The initial fear of the crossing was one thing, but 6 days of this? 6 days of watching a silent enemy circle your walls without attacking. No siege towers being constructed, no rams being built, no trenches being dug, just people walking and priests blowing horns. There must have been soldiers on those walls who started to relax, who began to mock, who convinced themselves that these strange wanderers had lost their nerve. There must also have been others who couldn't sleep at night. And then came the 7th day. They rose early, before dawn. The text is specific about this. They rose at the break of dawn and marched around the city in the same way 7 times. 7 circuits on the 7th day. This final march would cover a distance of perhaps 18 or 20 miles in total, circling a city that archaeological estimates suggest had a perimeter of roughly 900 yards. The sun climbed higher, the dust rose, the trumpets kept blowing, the people kept silent. Round after round, the walls still standing, the gates still locked, Rahab's scarlet cord still hanging in the window. 7 times around, and on the 7th time, as the priests blew the long, sustained blast of the ram's horns, Joshua's voice finally rang out across the thousands of people who had waited, who had walked, who had obeyed in silence for 6.5 days. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And they shouted. The sound that erupted from that multitude, the compressed 7-day silence finally released into a single collective roar, must have been something extraordinary to hear. A sound that carried every prayer, every step, every night of waiting, every year of wandering. A sound that carried the weight of a promise. And the walls fell down flat, not partially, not gradually, not in one section that created a breach. The walls fell down flat, and every man charged straight in, and they took the city. The language used is emphatic and total. The walls collapsed outward, not inward, creating a ramp of rubble that the Israelites climbed directly into the city. There is a remarkable detail here that archaeologists have noted with great interest. Excavations at the site, believed to be ancient Jericho, have found evidence of a destruction layer consistent with the biblical account. Mud brick collapse on the outside of the stone retaining wall, forming exactly the kind of ramp that would allow an army to charge straight up and into a city. The destruction was evidently total and swift, not the result of a prolonged siege. The city burned. The text says it burned with fire, but not all of it. One house stood. The 2 spies who had made a promise now had to keep it. They went to Rahab's house in the wall, brought her out along with her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her, and led them to safety outside the camp. A woman who had been a prostitute in a condemned city became the ancestor of the Davidic line. She is listed, centuries later, in the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth. The scarlet cord that saved her family is echoed across time in the red thread of redemption that runs through the entire biblical story. The city itself was devoted to destruction, a concept in ancient Israelite warfare called the herem, meaning that the city and its contents were set apart, consecrated entirely to God. The silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron were to go into the treasury of the Lord. Everything else was to be burned. This was not a conquest for plunder or personal enrichment. It was an act of consecration, a first offering of a land whose every inch was understood as a gift. One man did not follow this command. His name was Achan, from the tribe of Judah, and he secretly took a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold, and buried them in the floor of his tent. This act, small and hidden as it was, would cascade into disaster at the very next battle, the assault on a much smaller city called Ai. Israel's army would be routed there in humiliation, and the connection between hidden sin and collective consequence would be made searingly clear. But that is a story for another telling. What the Fall of Jericho teaches, beyond its drama and its supernatural spectacle, is something deeply human. There is a kind of courage that looks like inaction, a kind of faith that looks like foolishness. The soldiers who walked silently around that city day after day were not passive. They were doing something profoundly difficult. They were choosing, moment by moment, to trust an instruction that made no logical sense. Every trained military instinct they had must have screamed at them. Every observer watching from the walls must have laughed at them. And they kept walking. The ancient rabbis noted something fascinating about the command to be silent. They said that the silence was not just tactical, it was spiritual. The people were not allowed to fill the air with their own voices because God needed room to work. Their silence was their submission. Their obedience was their weapon. And consider the priests, 7 of them, carrying ram's horn trumpets, walking at the front of this procession. The shofar, the ram's horn, was not primarily a weapon of war. It was an instrument of worship. It was blown on holy days, at the new moon, at times of solemn assembly. These priests were not marching in military formation. They were performing an act of worship around a fortified city. They were treating the most dangerous place in Canaan as if it were already a sanctuary. There is something in that image that stops the breath. Jericho also stands as a bookend to Egypt. The generation that left Egypt had watched the Red Sea part. They had seen the plagues. They had eaten manna from the sky and drunk water from a rock. They had been surrounded by wonders so constant that wonder itself became ordinary, and in that ordinariness they had lost their ability to trust. Their children, standing at Jericho, had inherited the stories. But at the Jordan, they were given a miracle of their own, and at Jericho, they were given a test of their own. Would they obey when the command made no sense? Would they walk in silence when everything in them wanted to shout? Would they trust when they could not see how the walls could possibly fall? They did, and the walls fell. There is a reason that this story has survived for thousands of years. There is a reason that it is told in synagogues and churches and homes and schools across the globe, that it has inspired art and music and literature across cultures and centuries. It is not simply because the walls fell. It is because of everything that had to happen before the walls fell. The 40 years, the river, the silence, the walking, the 7 days, the moment of release. The Fall of Jericho is a story about the space between the promise and the fulfillment. It is a story about what you do in that space, whether you walk, whether you trust, whether you keep moving even when nothing visible has changed. The walls did not begin to tremble on day 1, or day 3, or day 6. They stood, solid and ancient and immovable, right up until the moment they didn't. And then, in an instant, they were dust. Rahab's cord still hung in the window, one small thread of red against the ruin of a city. A woman who had made a choice, who had heard a story and believed it, who had hidden strangers and made a promise, and the promise held. When everything else in Jericho collapsed, her house stood. Her family walked out. Her story continued. That scarlet thread is still speaking. Thousands of years later, it still speaks. The Jordan Valley is quiet now. The ancient mound called Tel es Sultan sits in the modern West Bank, its layers of human history compressed into silent earth, awaiting further excavation, further discovery. Tourists walk its slopes and look out over the valley where Joshua's army once made camp. They look toward the river. They imagine the sound of feet on hard ground, the low, steady call of ram's horns in the morning air, the silence of a people who had decided to believe. And somewhere, beneath the dust, if the archaeologists are right, beneath the layers of mud and ash and time, there is a wall that fell down flat. Not by battering ram, not by siege tower, not by any engine of war the ancient world had ever seen. It fell because 7 priests blew 7 trumpets for 7 days, and thousands of ordinary people chose to be obedient in the most extraordinary way, by walking, by being quiet, and by trusting that when the moment came and the shout went up, the God who had parted seas and stopped rivers would keep one more promise. He did. The walls fell, and the land, at last, began.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.